Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like-minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but 2 of my last 3 trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler, and thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler Podcast, Episode 68. Today, the Amateur Traveler Podcast goes back to Alberta and the Canadian Rockies.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no. 15-hour flight, oh, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Christensen.
We want to hear about the balcony with the view of the Acropolis and the deck with a view of Wrigley Field. So what's your story? Visit Sheridan.com to share your story and get tips from fellow travelers.
I have 3 news stories for you today. The first one, 4 Air Canada crew members were injured Sunday after their Shanghai to Vancouver flight hit turbulence about an hour after takeoff. The Air Canada 767 made an emergency landing in Tokyo and no other injuries were reported. Just after that, a Japan Airlines flight had 2 passengers who were thrown into the overhead storage compartment when the plane hit turbulence and lost altitude. The fasten seatbelt sign had been turned off. This is just a great reminder. Even when the pilot turns off the fasten seatbelt sign, please remember, keep your seatbelt fastened. You just never know when you might run into turbulence. In the second news story, the Carnival cruise ship Liberty is in Fort Lauderdale getting a serious scrubbing. You may not have heard that the ship had a problem with the virus on board. They're not quite sure what the source of it was, but more than 530 guests and 140 crew members reported to the ship's infirmary during a 16-day voyage. On a lighter note, if you're interested, I was interviewed recently for a podcast called the Home-Based Travel Agent Podcast, and I'll put links to all 3 of those stories, including the interview, in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. For those of you who are new listeners to the show, this is actually the second part of a two-part episode. Last week I talked about the first part of a trip to the Canadian Rockies, and that particular trip started in Calgary, and then we drove to Edmonton, where we saw the world's largest mall, and then we drove to Jasper, and I talked somewhat about Jasper and some of the wildlife there, as well as the Athabasca Glacier and the Columbian ice fields. And the last show ended with the tour of the glacier on a snow coach. So if you're interested in more about that and you haven't heard that yet, you might want to go back and pick that out of the archives at amateurtraveler.com. So anyway, this week I'm going to continue that story about that trip. So when last we left, we were driving south on the Icefields Parkway from the Athabasca Glacier and heading to Lake Louise. When you're in the Banff National Park, which is the southern of the two parks, Jasper and Banff, along the British Columbia and Alberta border in the Canadian Rockies, you're actually in the more touristed parks. So the first thing that you'll notice in this part of the Canadian Rockies versus being up in Jasper is that you will see a lot more people. And that's especially true at the two destinations of Lake Louise and Banff if you go there during the peak season. During the summer season, you'll get much less if you go there in the shoulder season, if you go there in the fall or in the spring. But once you get on the Icefields Parkway, you'll really start running into a lot fewer visitors very quickly, as a lot of people are still doing bus tours and don't seem to get even as far as the Athabasca Glacier. Mind you, you'll see a few tourists there, but you'll see a lot more once you get down to Lake Louise and Banff. But as you go down south on the parkway, you'll see things like the Crowfoot Glacier, which is a glacier which used to have three individual pieces coming down off of the mountain. It's a hanging glacier, meaning that it's up on the mountain and comes to a stop hanging in midair, and the ice will then fall off there. Now it's only maybe 1.5 of a crow's foot because this, like the other glaciers in the area, are receding. As you stop on the Icefields Parkway, there are all sorts of nice little stops that you can go for a short hike or a much longer hike if you're the adventurous type. We stopped, for instance, at Upper and Lower Waterfall Lakes. We were hoping to spot the majestic moose, which you may recall in last week's show we had not yet seen on this trip. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the moose call, I believe it goes something like this. "Hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat." Sorry. One should never podcast after a long week at work. Our next major stop was at Lake Louise. And Lake Louise and the hotel there, Chateau Lake Louise, have been a stop for tourists for many years. Chateau Lake Louise, as well as the Banff Springs Hotel, and also the Empress Hotel, which I mentioned in the episode on Vancouver and Victoria, were all built by the Canadian Pacific Railroad that was basically trying to draw tourists out to the western part of Canada, to this very beautiful area. The website for Chateau Lake Louise has this to say about the history of the hotel. In the summer of 1882, young Thomas Wilson was employed by the Canadian Pacific Railway, packing supplies and equipment for construction crews for Kicking Horse Pass. One night, while camped with a group of Stoney Indians, he heard a rumble of avalanches. Using his limited vocabulary of native words and some sign language, Wilson learned that the noise came from the snow mountains above the Lake of Little Fishes. The next day, 2 Stoney guides took Wilson to the lake on horseback. The first white man to see what he originally named Emerald Lake was captivated by the blue and green water of the gem beneath the glacier. He sat and gazed, sharing a smoke with his companions. "As God is my judge, I never in all my explorations saw such a matchless scene." And later on, Lake Louise was renamed Lake Louise in honor of Princess Louise Caroline Alberta, the 4th daughter of Queen Victoria. I would have to say that I've shared the impression of Mr. Wilson as we gaze at Lake Louise. It is a very picturesque spot. It's also a very romantic spot. It's someplace that you're likely to see couples getting married if you're there in the summertime. Lovely spot to stop and walk around, to hike towards the end of the lake, or perhaps take a horseback ride. I've also rented a canoe on Lake Louise with my family when I was a kid. wonderful spot to get out and paddle a canoe. Just gorgeous because the lake, at the end of the lake, is this very picturesque glacier that comes right down to the lake, and on a wonderful clear day, unlike the last time we were there, unfortunately, it's just really one of the most beautiful spots I've been to. Sadly, as I mentioned in the last show, when we were there were tremendous forest fires in the area, and most of the pictures that I have of this particular trip are very hazy from the smoke from those fires. Oh, and the name of that glacier I didn't mention is the Victoria Glacier. If you want a closer look at the glacier, you can certainly hike to one of two tea houses that are on the mountain that the glacier is on. The two tea houses are the Lake Agnes Tea House and the Six Glaciers Tea House. To get to the Six Glaciers, for instance, it's a 3.6 mile hike, I believe, and a total elevation change of 1,200 feet, but you should be forewarned that that is coming from 5,500 feet, which is the elevation of the lake, so it is thinner air, so be advised. And if you get there, I'm told, and I haven't been there, that the tea is very good, although the prices are a little bit high, but when you consider that everything has been flown in by helicopter, it might be reasonable. And for the fan of winter sports, be aware that there are 3 ski areas in the Banff and Lake Louise area. You can ski at Mount Norquay in Banff, or you can ski at Lake Louise or Sunshine Village, which is also closer to Banff. It doesn't take that long before it can get cold in this area. When I first visited the Banff area, I was there in August, and on August 17th we had snow. That was near the Athabasca Glacier, but still this area can get quite cold and has a relatively short summer. If you are a train buff, one thing that you might be interested in knowing is just west of Lake Louise and the Banff National Park, in Yoho National Park, as you head towards Vancouver, you'll come to Kicking Horse Pass. And in Kicking Horse Pass, the trains, as they go descending here from the Canadian Rockies, actually have to go through a series of spiral tunnels to get down from this elevation. As we move further east towards Banff, one of the other areas that is recommended for a nice hike is Johnston Canyon. The one thing I would say is at the height of the summer, though, in the middle of the day, Johnston Canyon can get very crowded. So I would go there early or possibly even later in the day. But Johnston Canyon is a very beautiful canyon leading in. The end of the hike is a small cave to walk through and then a pool with a waterfall in it. So a lovely little hike, but just a little crowded in the middle of the day. Banff is a lovely little town. There is no truth to the rumor that you try and pronounce both F's in the word Banff, as my family sometimes does. And in the summertime, for a nice view of Banff, there are 2 options. One is the Mount Norquay ski area is also open in the summertime, so you can take the chairlifts up. I would also recommend rather highly the Sulphur Mountain Gondola, which goes up above the Banff Springs Hotel, which sits like a castle there in Banff on the river. We did not get a chance to go up the last time I was there. I've been up there twice and really enjoyed it, but the time we were there, they show you what it's like at the via video camera of what it looks like from the top, and you couldn't see anything, unfortunately, because of all the smoke from the forest fires. So my family hasn't had a chance to see that yet. We'll have to get back to Banff someday. A couple different places to eat that I would recommend in town. We liked some of the places that we tried out. The first one is the obvious one, and that's the Banff Springs, a wonderful place for brunch in particular. I would recommend that, both a beautiful setting as well as very good food. We also found a couple of smaller restaurants like Melissa's Mistake was a very good dinner opportunity, and also Maggie and Stumps for just some more simple food. And then I would also recommend stopping at Cow's Ice Cream while you're shopping in downtown Banff. There are many more interesting drives and hikes in the Banff area. I'll put a link in the show notes and in the iTunes enhanced version to a brochure of interesting drives and hikes in Banff. One place to point out, if you're a fan of history or of ghost towns, would be Bankhead, which is a ghost town that used to be a big coal mining town in the area near Banff, just east of Banff. Our next stop is Calgary. One interesting place to stop on the road between Banff and before you get to downtown Calgary is the Calgary Olympic Park. Calgary held the Winter Olympics, you may recall, in 1988, and it still has the Olympic Park, which it uses for training Winter Olympic athletes, and you can take tours of the park. It's not uncommon when you do tours, and I've done tours on 2 or 3 different occasions, to see athletes in the middle of training, and it's really quite something when you're standing there at the bobsled track, for instance, and the Canadian team is going down in the sleds, and the rumble of the big sleds as they're going down there, and you're standing just 10 feet away from it, is more impressive than when you see it on TV or when you see them practicing on the big ski jump, even though they're practicing without snow or ice but actually using a type of plastic to simulate snow. It's still interesting to see from the top just how far down it looks. Not something that you would get me to do, I believe. But I would recommend as you're driving by there to stop, take the time, pay the money, do the tour, and see that facility, especially if you are a big fan of winter sports, or even like me if you're not necessarily. I think you'll find that a very enjoyable tour. The most recognizable building in Banff is definitely the Calgary Tower, which is also left over from the Olympics, which, like so many of these towers, does have a revolving restaurant at the top and does offer a nice view of the city. Not necessarily worth the money. It's really up to you. I did find that when you eat there on an expense account, you can write off the elevator cost as transportation to dinner, which is, I believe, what I wrote on my report, my expense report, when I went on a boondoggle up there. One interesting thing about Calgary is that since it does get a rather cold winter, it may be one of the cities that is best for visiting if you happen to be agoraphobic, because you don't have to go outside in the wintertime to get among the various sites in downtown Calgary, thanks to a system called Plus 15. Plus 15 is a series of bridges that go between various buildings. It's called Plus 15 because on average it is 15 feet above the ground. It's one floor up. There are parts of it that are also plus 30 and plus 45, 2 and 3 floors up, but basically you can get around town using this plus 15 series of walkways and bridges, and along there you can also find things like indoor gardens that would be very nice if you were in Calgary in the wintertime. In the summertime, Plus 15 also connects to it in all sorts of outside pathways in Calgary as well, and I'll put links to that in the show notes to the various walking and cycling paths in Calgary. Perhaps you'll be as lucky as us to stumble across someone shooting a film in downtown Calgary. That happens a little more these days, not quite as much as in Vancouver, but still some going on there. The most busy time in Calgary is probably in July, when Calgary hosts one of probably the 3 best rodeos in the world, and that is the Calgary Stampede. Your list of 3 best rodeos in the world may vary from mine. Mine would include the Cheyenne Frontier Days and then the California Rodeo in Salinas, California, which is my hometown. There are 2 other historic sites that I'm going to recommend in Calgary. The first one of which is Fort Calgary Historic Park, which dates to 1875, when the Canadian Mounties brought law and order to this particular area. So that offers an interpretive center, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I did the second, which is the Heritage Park Historic Village. The recommendations for Fort Calgary are to allow 1 to 2 hours, and for the Heritage Park Historical Village to allow 2 to 4. And my family did go there when my kids were relatively old. They were young teenagers at the time, and even they enjoyed it. Not being history buffs, the Heritage Park Historic Village, they particularly enjoyed the depth of knowledge that the docents at this particular historic park offered us. You go into the newspaper office and they can tell you how they put together the newspaper at that point with the movable type. Then you can go into the roundhouse and see the various trains and see the big snowplow trains, and the docent there will tell you about how they were used and what era and You can go into the jail and learn a little more about law and order in those days, or the hotel and see the early phones, or go into the schoolhouse and learn about what classrooms would have been like at the time. So it was very well done, and we enjoyed it. And I was a little surprised because, again, my kids are not big history buffs, but it really is a well-done museum that offers them the hands-on history that can make them enjoy it at the same time. Now, I should tell you, however, that Heritage Park is only my second favorite museum in the Calgary area. And the other one you're going to have to go a little further for, because it is conveniently located in Drumheller. And Drumheller is in the middle of the Alberta Plains. It's away from the Rockies, and it is 88 miles or 140 kilometers from Calgary. And I am strongly going to encourage you that if you're in the Calgary area, that you drive out to Drumheller. And the reason why you're going to drive out to Drumheller is to go to the Royal Turle Museum of Paleontology. So it's out here on the big Great Plains here in Alberta. You're going to drive through farmland to get there, through little tiny towns, and finally you're going to get to Drumheller. And you're going to know you got to Drumheller when you drive past a very large concrete Tyrannosaurus Rex with tourists in its jaws, because you can pay your money and go up in this particular piece of roadside paraphernalia here, and I'll put a picture in the show notes, and it's also the one picture that those of you who have the iTunes MP3 version will be able to see, because it's the picture that I've used as the cover art for this episode. And if you look closely in the Tyrannosaurus mouth, you'll see little tiny tourists who are using this as a lookout to look out on Drumheller. This is not the Royal Turle Museum of Paleontology, but it's just part of Drumheller's claim to fame, and as a center of paleontology in the world, it's really one of the leading museums as well as research facility into paleontology. And it's located out here in Drumheller not simply because real estate is inexpensive, but because of the geology of the area. Drumheller is located in an area of badlands, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, badlands is an area of clay soil that has been particularly eroded, often having hoodoos, for instance. Hoodoos, the most famous of these rock spires you might find in Bryce National Park in the United States, which I've done another podcast on. But basically, Drumheller has this area where the erosion has revealed layers of soil that go back to the ages of dinosaurs. And therefore, finding dinosaur bones in this particular area is something that is not uncommon. And as you go through the Royal Turle Museum of Paleontology, you will find some tremendous examples of dinosaurs from various ages. So you will see full-size Albertosauruses, which are related to a Tyrannosaurus and very large and imposing, and get a chance to know just exactly how large those teeth are that they carry around compared to you. You'll get a chance to see skeletons for such things as velociraptors or the Triceratops, or see the skulls for, and here's where my paleontology is a little rusty, I want to say Pachycephalosaurus, the dinosaurs with a very large cranial plate that we think that they knocked heads with each other, so they have this large bony head. And then you'll also get to see things from other ages, not the age of the dinosaur, both before and after. So you'll get to see some of the smaller life fossils, as well as things from the Ice Age, so a saber-toothed tiger or a woolly mammoth. And then in addition to this just being a museum, it is an active research facility, and there are other programs available, including going out with paleontologists for 3-kilometer hikes during certain times of the year, end of May to end of June, and on into August. At various times of the day, you can go out for a walk, a 90-minute journey out into the Badlands with a paleontologist who will show you where they're looking for things and how they find different things. So that's something you might enjoy as well. You're also fairly close when you're at the Royal Turle Museum to the Dinosaur Provincial Park, and I'll put a link in the show notes to a series of driving guides for the Canadian Badlands site, CanadianBadlands.com, that has some wonderful guides for driving tours in this area. A couple different days depending on what it is that you're looking for seeing. So they have, for those of you who are interested in paleontology, those particular driving tours, as well as driving tours for people interested more in homesteads or coal beds, some of that history of the coal mining in the area, as well as some of what the Mounties used to be doing. So take a look at that site at CanadianBadlands.com. But even if you don't do a whole 2 to 3 day driving tour, the 3 hours that it's going to take you to drive out to Drumheller and back into Calgary is really going to be worth it, especially if you allow enough time for some of the hikes and other programs that are offered at the museum. So take a look at the museum site, and I'll put that in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. And I'll use this opportunity also to plug the iTunes Enhanced version again. For those of you who are listening to the MP3 version, you've been missing my pictures of the dinosaurs. I'll have put up a photo gallery of some of my photos, not all the ones covered in the iTunes Enhanced version. And with that, we finish this 2-part episode on the Canadian Rockies and some of the surrounding area. There's certainly more that you can do in this area than I have mentioned, but that's where we're going to end this show for now, as it is getting late on a Sunday night and I want to get this show out. I don't have any internet resources for you this week. It just none popped out that I wanted to mention. If you have any good suggestions for internet resources for travel, please send them to me. Either call me at 206-MOM-LOVE, or send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. One person who sent me an email this week is Jerry, and Jerry is from the Parks Canada, from the British Columbia Parks particularly. And in the few emails that Jerry and I sent back, one thing that I should clarify from last week's show, I may have said that Jasper was the northernmost of the Canadian national parks, the largest and northernmost. If I did, I apologize. What I meant to say, of the parks in the Canadian Rockies, it's the northernmost and the largest of the 4 parks in that area. And Jerry did point out that there are numerous parks that are both larger or further north. So my apologies if I wasn't clear in that. Jerry also said in one of the letters that we exchanged this week, may I also suggest that you consider one of the faster growing segments of our touring population, heritage tourism, by doing some programs on heritage sites and cultural traditions. Thank you for the work you put into this program. I've truly enjoyed every one of your podcasts. They give me a much better idea of the places I may never visit, while also encouraging me to consider specific locations to eventually visit. Thanks, Jerry. It was strictly coincidental that Jerry wrote me that before I did an episode where I included things like Fort Calgary and Heritage Park. But as you have already learned by now, if you've been listening to the show for a while, I do have a love of history and of the heritage, and I find that part of touring to be one of the great motivations for me. So I hope we will continue to mention more and more things that have to do with history as we talk about various subjects in various places in this podcast. Jerry also wrote that, quote, "For 5 years I have served as an interpreter with Alberta Parks, serving at 4 different sites around the province. Then I was hired by Parks Canada and came to Fort Langley National Historic Park near Vancouver, where I served as one of the costumed interpretation staff for 10 years before moving into my current position. I have done this for 9 years now, and have really enjoyed learning and sharing elements of our past, from ancient Aboriginal lore to modern associations that help inform our future." So Jerry is actually one of those people who helps me to enjoy those historical sites so much. So thanks again for that, Jerry. And he also sent along 2 different lists of events that are going on in Canada, heritage festivals and various other heritage events in Canada that I will put in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I have one update that I'd like to add in. For those of you who listened to the show for a while, you may remember an episode on Divine Adventures, and Divine Adventures runs cycling and wine drinking tours, high-end tours for France and Spain and Italy and several other places in the world, including now actually California and Chile and New Zealand. But a couple weeks back, I had a chance to attend a reception in San Francisco with Andy Levine, the president of Divine Adventures, who was out in the area. And one of the things I learned at that was that they have won the 2006 winner from Maison de la France, which is the National Tourism Agency of France, as the best special product is the award that they won. So congratulations to Andy and to his team. And if you're interested in Divine Adventures, check them out. I'll put links to them in the show notes. And please, please, by all means, tell them that you were sent there by the Amateur Traveler podcast. And finally, two more reminders. One is that I am encouraging people who are interested in continuing to get the show to register for the show, to subscribe to the show. Subscription is free, and for those of you in iTunes, it's very simple to do. Just directions for that on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com if you look there. And I'm encouraging that people group their subscriptions on November 28th or December 14th, which happened to be my 25th wedding anniversary and my 46th birthday. And the reason for that is that will help my ranking in iTunes, as I talked last week to the person who runs iTunes at Apple. And then a reminder also, I've announced in the last two shows, but I am doing a contest where at midnight on January 31st, I'm going to go to the discussion boards at amateurtraveler.com/board, and I'm going to pick a post at random that adds value to that board, so not spam, and I'm going to award the person who posted that, provided they have put in their contact information in there, an iPod Shuffle, the new iPod Shuffle that clips on, which is perfect for listening to podcasts. So I'm hoping that someone who's been listening to the show for a long time will win that, but possibly it's somebody who's just listening for the first time and wants to take part in the boards. So check that out, amateurtraveler.com/board. And since I can no longer say the name of the show, it must be time to say good night, and thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest, served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, Pod Show and Limelight.